Welcome to the Exploring Washington State podcast. Here's your host, Scott Cowan.
Hi, everyone. Scott Cowan here. Welcome to this episode of the Exploring Washington State podcast. Today, you're going to be listening to a conversation I had with Brian Naron. Brian is one of the co-authors of the book Rusted Metal. Rusted Metal is the guide to Northwest heavy metal and hard rock music from about 1970 to 1995. This book weighs in at over 900 pages. There's over 600 bands referenced. There's over 100 interviews. It's packed full of Washington State music history. It's an amazing book. It's cool. Brian is also the part owner of Northwest Metalworks, which is a record label that is re-releasing some heavy metal and hard rock music from the Pacific Northwest. They've done some pretty cool stuff. You should check them out if you're into that genre of music. There'll be links in the show notes for all of that. So sit back, listen in. This is a great episode. Brian's a good guy. Known Brian since junior high school. Had no idea he was going to be an author, just like he had no idea I was going to be a podcast host. So I think you're going to like this one. Check it out. Let us know. Send us comments, feedback. If you've got any ideas for guests that we should be interviewing, please share them with us. Would love a review. Share this podcast with people. We'd appreciate it. Help get the word out as we do our best to promote the great state of Washington. All right, let's get started. My guest today is Brian Naron. Brian and I go back to Ford Middle School.
Indeed.
That's kind of creepy when you think about that. I thought when I was doing this with Wands that he'd be the person I've known the longest, but technically I think you're going to have that title, even though we haven't talked in a lot of years.
Right.
So Brian, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Scott.
So Brian, you are one of the authors for Rusted Metal, and this is a guide to heavy metal music in the Northwest. How did you guys come up with this idea? Give us the story.
So myself, I've always been into music, and especially local music. And a friend of mine, James Beach, who's the primary writer for the book, I've known him for about 30 years, and we shared a lot of the same types of likes in music. He's a writer by trade, did a magazine called Dark Discoveries for several years, focused on horror and sci-fi. But he did a few issues of the magazine related to those subjects with music. So focusing like on the soundtracks to these horror movies or sci-fi. And over the years, he and I have always talked about, music and what we like about it. And we got on a conversation, it's been quite a while ago, 7 or 8 years ago. And we said, man, there's been some books out about the local scene, mostly revolving around the early 90s when grunge exploded. And so there's biographies and all those kinds of bands, Nirvana and Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. And we were like, God, there's never really been an in-depth look at the hard rock scene. And kind of my joke way back in the 90s with friends or people that I knew in the music industry, they would go, oh, it must be great to live in Seattle where, Nirvana and Soundgarden are from. And I said, yeah, it is, but you should have seen the scene that came before it. And they're like, well, what do you mean? It's like, oh, we've always had this rich musical environment scene here. And so then I would start breaking into, you should have seen, Culprit. You should have seen the Heats. You should have seen the Allies. You should have seen, the early Queensryche years. There was just a ton of bands, and they never really got a lot of coverage. Some of the books that would come out in the 90s, they were mostly focused on that sort of grunge and punk scene that was in the area. And then there'd just be a little sliver of the book where they would talk about hard rock. And so James and I thought, we should really write a book. So about 6 years ago, we decided we were going to write a book. And Rusted Metal is the result of all of that work.
So since this is an audio only podcast, I'm going to try to give our listeners description. This thing weighs, what does the paperback weigh, do you think?
The paper
4 pounds, 5 pounds?
It weighs 5.87 pounds.
Okay, so almost 6 pounds.
Like a phone book.
It's like a phone book. It's 900 some pages. You guys went nuts here.
Yeah, it kind of got out of control. We started out by thinking that we could write a story about the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were writing it, and with the interviews that we did, we knew right away that it was going to be difficult to put everything in kind of a like chronological order. So what we decided to do was that with the band bios, we'd put them in alphabetical order.
Okay.
We did the interviews. We inserted the interviews in with the bands that were associated with the interviewee. And we decided that this was going to be a reference guide. And the nice thing about reference guides is that there's not that pressure to like read this thing stem to stern, that you can just go and grab it when inspiration strikes and go, well, hey, who was the bass player and culprit? Or, where was this venue that all these great bands played in? Well, you could just go back to it. And it's like a kind of like a lifetime book. You would be able just to use it and keep it, and you would be able to discover new things all the time. Our goal was to be, like 300 to 400 pages. And again, this thing just exploded. And the interest, once word got out, then, we had people, musicians, friends coming at us going, hey, I've got stories. You should make sure this band's in there. And so this thing just grew and grew.
One of the things that when I was flipping through this, and I've read some of the articles, by no means have I read the whole book. I can't say that, but I'm really impressed with the volume of photographs and playbills. And you guys there's a ton of stuff in this thing. Is this from your collections, or did the interviews help you?
I would say that 70% of the images in the book are part of my collection, James Beach, James Tolin, and Jim Sutton. So yes, we're music enthusiasts. We're also music memorabilia collectors, and so we also knew that was going to make for a very interesting book, having as much imagery as possible to illustrate the stories we were telling and giving history. So it's a bit of a piece of memorabilia. It's like going to the museum without actually having to leave the house, kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm looking back at some of these photos, and I'm like going, were they that young then? I mean, some of these guys, like, I haven't seen them. You don't think about how much we've all aged,
mm-hmm.
Or in 30, 40 years. It's like, wow. So approximately how many musical acts are in this book?
I mean, as far as like mentions,
how many bios did you guys do?
There's like 620 band bios.
Wow. And since this is all about Washington State and this is a Northwest book, approximately how many do you think are Washington State based?
I would say that probably 75% of the bands listed are Washington State. There's the next largest percentage would be Oregon.
Okay.
A few from Idaho and British Columbia. Some people will disagree with us, but we kind of feel that because of the connection with Vancouver, BC, and the bands, and they all played kind of this circuit. We thought we'd include as many of those bands as we could. By no means is this a complete guide of all the bands. This is basically the bands we knew about and a ton of bands we didn't know about, and did research. And as I say, people reached out to us and said, hey, I was in a band and we ran from this time to this time, and we did have a 7-inch single. And so it was like, yeah, great. Tell us more.
And then you also cover venues, and you kind of have there's just a lot of everything in here. So we'll come back to venues. Let's keep talking about the artists. So when you guys got started on this, how easy was it for you to make contact with these musicians? Were they willing to be part of it? I mean, I'm going to guess most were probably pretty happy to be part of it, but how easy was it to get a hold of these folks?
Some people were really excited about it. I think, one of our first interviews was with a guy who had a band in the 70s and 80s. The band was called Whiskey Stick, and we discovered him via the internet. We saw some YouTube sort of videos with images of the band, but we heard their music and we were like, wow, this is just incredible music. And why didn't we ever hear any more about these guys? And his name was Mark Bugas. So he was really excited because they did a lot of work decades ago that never came to fruition. And so they were really excited to be a part of it. Now, some bands, we requested some time to do interviews and they weren't interested. Some people we had people in mind that we wanted to talk to. And so it was just a matter of, some social media is great because, you can find people. But we knew a lot of these people too. We were friends with a lot of these musicians. So it was pretty easy to get most of the people. And there were some people, like I said, we would have loved to interview, but for whatever reason, they opted not to, and that's fine. But the fact that it took us, it probably took us 5 years to write it, 4.5 years to write it, about 1.5 years to edit it all.
Jeez. Wow.
Yeah.
Good for you guys for being, persistent and seeing it through. So many of us would have given up and it'd be stored on our computers on a hard drive as a PDF somewhere for years to come. I think it's very cool.
A lot of trips up and down the I-5.
So let me ask you this question. So all these bands at one time were in the Pacific Northwest. We'll just talk about Washington. Are most of the members still in Washington or have they dispersed? I mean, were you able to find,
yeah, there's still a lot of people who, still live in the same part of town in Tacoma or in Seattle where they used to. There's a lot of musicians that live in LA now or you live in Florida, but again, thanks to Zoom interviews, phone interviews, we're able to track people down and we did a lot of face-to-face as much as we could because we felt like, you get a different story. You get a more complete story when you're looking somebody in the eyes and they recognize that you're sincere. They might give you a little bit more information than just a list of questions on an email.
Sure. No, I 100% agree with you. I mean, Zoom works okay, but I think being in person is, plus you get the kind of the nonverbal cues from them.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That if you're like going down a good path or a bad path.
And part of it too is being face to face. Like I said, people can sense kind of who you are, and they know what your intentions are, and that was really important for us because we wanted people to open up about things, not only just give us the facts, but maybe tell us things they wouldn't normally tell us, just for a better story, because people. Bands are like marriages, sometimes they fell apart and people are still, it's amazing. Some people are still like at odds after 3-4 decades. And some of it was real hurtful for some people. And so we never really pushed our goal, our aim with this book was to make people happy. And we have, we've had people email us and go, I can't believe you have our band in here. That's so great. We were just like we were a band for like 8 months. We put out a tape. We thought it was great. And then nothing ever came of it and we just broke up. And you guys found us and, put us in print. So,
we exist.
Yeah.
So did you find when you guys were out there reaching out to people, did you uncover any music that hadn't, did somebody say, we did this years ago, or we did this last month and you guys should listen to it?
Yeah. That was kind of an interesting byproduct of starting this book was, as collectors, we're always looking for these hard to find gems. People put out records and put out tapes, and this was before the CD era in a lot of cases for bands. And so James and I decided that, gosh, if we're uncovering all this stuff and people are offering up, information and their music, it'd be great to get some of this stuff out, because some of it just was so limited in its release when it came out. Or in the case of like Whiskey Stick, they had recorded everything and they just never put it to wax. It fell apart and they just put it away. And
what happened there?
Yeah. So we decided, well, let's start a record label. Sure. Why not? And so we started out with a compilation with 11 different bands spanning the time between 76 and 91. And they were all pretty varied. And we got permission for every song. And all 11 artists were eager to have, like a demo song, something never released on this. And they were happy with a copy of the album when it was done. So we did a limited edition of 500. That's kind of our model. We usually do like a color for 100 or 150, and the rest are black vinyl. And so it all kind of ties in really nice. So we've presented some new music to the world. We kind of consider ourselves rock and roll archivists and archaeologists. I mean, we've found things that we really thought were good and should be out there, and so we've put out 7 records now.
Wow.
of bands gone by. But it's interesting that some of the bands from that time, from the 80s and the 90s, some of those bands are still active. And
give me an example.
We've got TKO. TKO was kind of the AC/DC or Van Halen of Seattle. They were a really big band in the late 70s and early mid 80s. They're still somewhat active. Lots of members changing hands as they've always have, but Brad Sinsel, the singer, is still the constant in that band. You've got bands like Queensryche that are, that band is still thriving. Jeff Tate on his own in his Operation Mindcrime band is still thriving. Those guys are all real active, obviously on a national and international scale. Culprit is reformed. And then, a lot of guys that were in, like I've mentioned before, even kind of hard rock dance bands, a lot of those musicians are still pretty active. Steve Pearson, Steve Alamant, those guys, they'll never stop playing. But no, again, with Whiskey Stick, we just the involvement with them, getting them in this book, getting this record out that they wanted to put out 30 years ago. They've got reformed and played some shows. So our activities have sparked interest in a lot of those bands, reforming. So it's been kind of a good thing.
Yeah, I was looking on your website. It's pretty interesting what you guys have available for sale. So we'll put a link below the episode so that people want to check it out. They can do that. That's, happy to do that, and people should go listen to. I think, music is, I don't have the collection like you do. You're sitting there behind a wall of hundreds that I can see. And I'm going to guess if you move the camera, it would continue for a few more feet each way.
It would be. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that's been your thing in life.
It's been my passions. It's the one constant since I was a small kid. It's just kind of filled my soul. It's an aesthetic of life. And
yeah. So how many interviews did you conduct?
I was part of, I was either the central figure or part of the duo, or in some cases there was 3 of us doing interviews, probably in half of them.
Okay.
I would say. Yeah.
So I bet there was some stories that you could tell about some of these interviews, things that went great, things that might not have gone so well. Any funny moments there that you can share?
Oh, there's lots of interesting stories and fun stuff. There's a lot of things we ended up not putting in the book.
Sure.
It's interesting when you're interviewing people, and we know what our goal is. And we had a number of people who would say, "Hey, this next part, I want you to leave it out of the book, but I want to tell you this story because it'll give you context of the other stuff I'm going to tell you." And we tried to avoid. We want to make people happy with this book. We don't want to be telling a bunch of salacious stories, although we heard tons of them.
Not in rock and roll, never.
Yeah, exactly. So we, try to keep it as on, I don't know if clean is the right word, but we just didn't want
PG-13.
We didn't want anybody's feelings to get hurt,
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, yeah, there were some fun stories about. I keep going back to Whiskey Stick, just because there was a ton of great activity with those guys. Before they were a band as Whiskey Stick, the main characters in the band were in a band called United Flight, and they were kind of a deep purplish kind of band, driven by a Hammond B3 organ. And when Deep Purple came over in 1969 for, I believe, their second American tour, all of their gear got hung up in customs, and they were starting the show in Salem at the Salem Armory. And
in Salem, Oregon?
Yes.
Okay.
And then they came up to Seattle and they did Spokane. But beings that, the Hammond B3, if you know what that is, it's a huge instrument. It's like 700 pounds, and not a lot of people had those, and they were very expensive. It just so happened that Terry, the organist keyboard player in United Flight, had one in his band. And so he contacted Deep Purple's management back then and said, "Hey, I got you covered. You can borrow my Hammond." And they're like, "Well, do you want to open up for us?" And so they ended up opening up for Deep Purple, and John Lord, the keyboard player in Deep Purple, autographed the inside of his Hammond B3 organ, and he still played that thing until he passed on, but they used it in Whiskey Stick as well. That was kind of a fun story. With that, with some of the local 80s shows, we had some pretty famous people come through town in these little local bars, and sometimes the stories got away from people. But there was a time in 81 when Def Leppard was in town for their second show ever in Seattle, and they went to a club called the End Zone, and they were in between gigs between the Seattle and Portland gig, and they had a day off. And so they got talked into going to make this promotional appearance at the End Zone, which was like a video arcade with a stage. So they had a band playing, and they had all kinds of video games and loud music playing. And apparently the band wasn't all that happy about spending their afternoon at this video arcade. They wanted to do something different. As it turns out, they show up, and the owner and the promoter gave each guy like a big wad of quarters. And so they played video games, and there was a band playing on the stage, and one of the bands was called The Mob. And The Mob had this lead singer that everybody wanted in their band. A band called Myth played with them too. Well, Jeff Tate from Queensryche sang with The Mob that day. And so years later, Joe Elliott would make some comments about how he discovered Queensryche. They were
in an arcade.
Yeah. Lita Ford played Lake Hills back in like 82.
Lake Hills was in Bellevue, right?
Yes, it was in Bellevue's Crossroads neighborhood. It was a skating rink, and it had been a venue for music and skating since like the 50s, and a lot of famous musicians went through that place over the years, and that was kind of the epicenter of the East Side hard rock scene. Promoter Craig Cook and Brett Miller and a couple other people were booking shows and having Battle of the Bands, and many bands played there. Rail played there, TKO, Shadow with Mike McCready. We had Overlord, just tons and tons of bands. And some of these guys went on to bigger and better things. But it was a scene that started in that area. And a lot of people consider it, again, kind of the epicenter of the hard rock scene in the Pacific Northwest.
You mentioned Mike McCready. I was kind of looking at the bio you guys did on him, and I was only aware of him in Pearl Jam, so I didn't know. And then Shadow, I personally don't know anything about Shadow, but it sounds like I might have been missing something there. It sounds like they were before their time, maybe.
Maybe. I mean, they were a good little hard rock band, kind of in the vein of kind of like Def Leppard or UFO, and they had the Friel brothers were the rhythm section, and Mike McCready being one of the younger ones on guitar, and they got a lot of press. They got a lot of really good shows. They were really popular. The girls really liked them, and they were around for a number of years, for most of the 80s, and then like a lot of bands, they just kind of folded. They never put anything out per se. Although Mike McCready has his own record label called Hockey Talker, and he ended up putting Talker, yeah,
Hockey Talker.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And he put out a 10-inch single of a couple of Shadow songs, and it's a real collectible item. And we were actually in negotiations with him. He asked us if we wanted to put out the Shadow record, and we were like, well, of course we would be happy to. But was kind of like, well, you've got a label, why aren't you? So maybe we shouldn't ask that question, because he decided that he wasn't going to go with us. But yeah, he was in a ton of bands, ones that we know about, Pearl Jam and Temple the Dog, and was involved with a lot of other local musicians, either playing guest guitar or producing albums. Again, the scene is, so many people were parts of so many other bands, and as you know, if you ever go to shows, it's like half the crowd oftentimes are the other bands that are in the crowd. Yes. So and they're friends of the bands, and well, I used to play bass with him, or I used to play drums with him or her, and right. So that's never changed. That's always been kind of a constant.
So here's a question for you that just came to my mind. So I'm warning, the sound you hear is the bus backing over you. So you keep mentioning, musicians kind of are interchangeable. They move around a lot, right? In the book, is there someone that comes to mind that was in a lot of bands? Like you've got them named in a bunch more than somebody else. Like, was anybody really a gun for hire and would play?
I would say, a guy like Evan Sheely. Evan Sheely is a bass player. Evan Sheely originally grew up in Yakima with Brad Sinsel. Brad Sinsel being the singer from TKO and War Babies. So they grew up together. They moved to the Seattle area about the same time. Evan Sheely's been like the go-to bass player for a lot of artists in the 70s and 80s. He guested on a ton of bands' albums. He used to have Base Northwest. It was a store for, better part of 20 years. He was in, again, like I say, he was in TKO. He was in Q5. He's been in other iterations of so many bands. I'd have to look in the book, but I mean, he's a guy that comes up a lot because he was in bands in the 60s through now. I mean, he kind of retired here just the last couple of years and moved to Southern Oregon. But he had been involved in bands and helping musicians in, I would say, 6 or 7 different interviews with musicians. Evan came up in the conversations as, I would have never played in a band if it hadn't been for Evan. Here I am, this long-haired, greasy kid, and Evan would always take really good care of me. I would come in, he would not talk me down. He'd be like really encouraging and helpful and show me stuff. And he'd always work me a deal so, I could buy this bass guitar and I'd put it on payments, and, he'd let me miss a few. And Evan's just a really great guy, really knowledgeable, really respected. So he came up a lot. Not only just his involvement with the bands, but his involvement with the music community.
So another part of the book, you've got venues in there, which I said we'd come back to, but you also have recording studios in there.
Yeah.
And publications. Right.
I'm
saying these things so that I can remind myself to bring them up later in the interview. So let's go to venues. Venues for 200, Alex. What venues did you guys? Well, let's just talk venues. Just where were some of the cool venues of, say, the 70s and 80s that were being brought up?
Well, going back then, you had places like the East Lake Zoo, you had the Aquarius, you had the Blue Moon, where a lot of the psychedelic bands played. There was actually an aqua. What they call it? A Green Lake Aqua Stage. There was actually a floating stage on Green Lake.
Zeppelin played there.
Vanilla Fudge played there. Sick Field, the old baseball field where the Rainiers played. The original Rainiers.
And for 1 year, the Seattle Pilots.
That's right. And so those were some of those early venues. So many venues, but as the 70s gave way to the 80s, and sort of dance music became more of the trend, there was a lot of competition for those venues. And so, like the Central Tavern, let's say. So they played music 5 or 6 nights a week. On any given week, you could see somebody from back in the 60s who was doing something, Jerry Miller would be playing. And then you'd see Mother Love Bone playing. And then you'd see Pearson and the Rainshoods playing. Hall of Fame, Meeker's Landing. But for hard rock and metal, there were a few places that embraced them. The Metropolis, they did a lot of punk rock, a lot of hard rock shows in Seattle. In Linwood, there was the Riviera Steakhouse. Had a really good sound system, really good stage, and they did a lot of shows. And as I mentioned before, we've got Lake Hills. It was also called the Palace at one point before it closed. That skating rink, but a ton of bands, and it was an all ages club. So that was what was really important to build that scene, is because anybody could go.
How about over in Central and Eastern Washington? How about Yakima or Spokane? Anything come up during your research on those cities?
There were like I guess there was a place called the Ranch. I want to say.
Oh,
Um,
yes. You spent many, many, many nights there.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You spent quite a bit of time on that end of the state. So, gosh, I feel kind of dumb.
I'm trying to think. There was some place down in Yakima and I didn't go to Yakima a lot, but I was always curious.
There was a place in Yakima called the Frontier Room. It was in the back of a restaurant. I can't remember the restaurant, but they would play a lot of bands in that. And I, I'd have to be really motivated to drive all the way to Yakima to see a band. I stuck pretty close to Tacoma and Seattle myself. James, being originally a Portland guy, saw a lot of shows like at Satyricon and there was just a ton of rooms down there. The Starry Night embraced hard rock and metal down there. But a lot of venues were like the VFW halls, Eagles clubs. The Lake City VFW was a really popular place for a lot of hard rock bands. You had the North Shore Surf Club in Olympia, 4th Street Tavern, Red Roof Pub in Lakewood. And again, Central Clubhouse in Tacoma. Clubs kind of came and went too, so that's always been the challenge in Seattle. Going back to the all age sort of ban during the 80s, and these kids having a heck of a time finding a place to play.
Did you guys bring up anything about Parker's Roadhouse?
Parker's, I think Parker's came up. Parker's would host a lot of sort of like mid-tier national acts. Yep. If you want to call Johnny Winter a mid-tier, I mean, he was he was very popular, but for Johnny Winter could play a Paramount, let's say, 1,200 seater, but oftentimes he was playing like Parker's and playing for 800 people. And that was an opportunity for a lot of local bands to play. Anytime you'd have that kind of performer, they're looking for local acts usually, because they're not supporting anyone on tour. I mean, they're trying to support themselves. So, Ballard Firehouse was another popular place in the 80s and 90s.
The Ballard Underground was
Hall of Fame.
Parker's, Astor Park.
Astor Park was a great place. Again, a lot of national acts. U2 played there, and
Petty played there once.
Petty, yep, I
think so.
Gosh.
But you guys are right. In Washington State and the Pacific Northwest has this really rich musical heritage from going back, 100 years. We've created, there are a lot of very well-known acts have been created here in Washington State. Put you on the spot, you personally. What was the greatest band out of Washington State?
Well, I guess from the standpoint of their longevity, from my standpoint, I think Queensryche. They've got a 40-year anniversary coming up this year, next year, somewhere in that range. It kind of varies, but certainly, Heart, Jimi Hendrix, those all fit in. A lot of people would argue and say probably the Sonics.
Now I got to tell a story here, because I thought I knew who the Sonics were, but I was wrong. I was watching a couple weeks ago. I watched a YouTube video from Easy Street Records in West Seattle with the Sonics. I think it was back maybe 2013 or something like that. And my takeaway was I don't know that I've ever seen a human being hit drums as hard as their drummer hits. I mean, they're in their 70s, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. And the energy and stamina that the whole band put out was amazing. And I didn't realize that they were as influential as they were.
Yeah, a lot of local musicians, as well as international musicians, have cited the Sonics. A lot of people actually say that the Sonics were like the first punk rock band. When you think of the volumes they played at, the sort of lyrical content with songs like "Psycho" and "The Witch," and they were influential to Iggy Pop in his career. I mean, he was crazy for those guys. MC5, Mudhoney, Mark Arm, has said in many interviews that the Sonics were, Sonics and Iggy Pop were, huge influence on his career.
One venue, I go there. Well, we don't go anywhere right now.
No,
but the Tractor in Ballard has been a venue that's, I think, done a pretty nice job of keeping a fairly broad list of bands playing there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, genres wise, they don't just really niche it down. So come back to the Tractor. But how about let's transition into the studios that were recording these bands. What did you guys find out about studios?
Well, there's been a ton of studios and sort of garage studios for years and years. A couple of the studios that were really mixing it up and doing a lot for this area were like London Bridge. They've been recording bands since the late 80s. They're no longer in business, but you had Triad in Redmond. A lot of hard rock bands went through there. A lot of demo tapes were recorded there with Tom Hall. He's a big player in the scene. Terry Date, who's gone on to national and international acclaim. He's recorded and engineered people as diverse as Soundgarden and Sir Mix-a-Lot. There were Crow Studios in Seattle. There's Egg Studios with Conrad. Did a lot of recording, mostly pop, but I'm certain that there were some hard rock bands that recorded at Egg Studios. I've got a lot of friends that have recorded with that studio, and I think that they're also just in the last few years have kind of called it quits. There's always been people who've had studios, not necessarily just a business, like a frontline business. There's a guy in Port Orchard, Tony Reed, who has a home recording studio, is quite a large one. He records both digitally and analog, and with today's technology and the cost of it is more friendly than ever, a lot of studios are popping up and people can do self recording and editing and things. But back in the day, there was still you still had to kind of play the recording game. You had to know somebody, you had to have money, and then you also had to get on the schedule. And so a lot of bands had to, if they wanted to get something recorded at a reasonable price, they were recording at midnight and 2:00 in the morning and things as such.
And I always thought it was because they were late sleepers that they didn't.
Well, that is the case for a lot of them, but some musicians had to work.
True.
had to be able to afford their habit.
And did you talk about promoters in the book?
We talked about Jeff Gilbert. Jeff Gilbert was part of the KCMU radio station in Washington, University of Washington. And, he did a lot of promoting of shows. He was managers for bands, was part of the Penny Lane record store group through the 80s and early 90s. We've got Craig Cook, who still book shows, as a matter of fact, but he was real instrumental in doing a lot of the Battle of the Bands on the East Side with the Lake Hills scene. He also booked a lot of bands for up north at the casinos. So he does a lot of casino booking. Jill Hatcher, she's a gal who has revived the Sky River festival. She's done it the last few years. It was actually one of the first big rock festivals. I think this year's would have been their 52nd anniversary had they been able to do it. But they did their first show the year before Woodstock. And they have, lots of different acts from the 60s and 70s that have done that show. And it was kind of spotty in the 80s and 90s, but it's being revived. Boy, gosh, you didn't have to be like a full-time working like promoter of a show. We have friends that book shows in the 80s and 90s. Cyrene Pobart just loved music, and a lot of her friends are musicians. So she would book halls like Washington Hall in Capitol Hill and put on shows. Even James and I have booked and a couple of shows and promoted a couple of hard rock metal festivals over the last few years. Again, sort of another sort of finger of the Northwest Metalworks scene here. We've put these bands together. There's still a really strong do-it-yourself kind of mentality in this area. I think we've always been kind of cut off from the mainstream. So I think that's why we've always kind of created this really unique kind of feeling or kind of sound in the Pacific Northwest.
There was one really big promoter in the 80s that brought in all the national acts like to the center.
John Baptiste was another.
Now that's a name, but it's not the name I'm looking for. This guy was, I want to say Gary. I could go back and look at some old tickets from shows and boy, yeah. I can't.
Gary doesn't.
I hate it when I can't, recall that information.
I don't have an endemic memory like my partner James. That guy, he just knows pretty much everything. It's kind of freaky. So he would know the answer right off the top of his head.
You go, it's so and so, yeah. Well, so we have barely scratched the book. I mean, let's be honest. It's 900 pages. We've covered 10.
Yeah.
So you guys, you got started because you're passionate about music. You're record collectors, but you have a record store, right? Yeah,
I have it's called Inner Groove. It's in 3rd Street Antiques in Puyallup. I told myself years and years ago that if I was going to have an expansive music collection, my collection needed to pay for itself. So I didn't have to take money out of my groceries to buy music. So, so the store is, I'm able to connect with people who are like-minded and want music, and I'm on the lookout. And so I do a lot of buy, sell, trade, and it again, helps support my hobby. So yeah, I've always been connected that way. I'm kind of a failed musician, so I supported the music scene from the other side of the microphone, as it were, whether it, going to shows, buying bands, swag, t-shirts, tapes, CDs. And then, just I've had some kind of storefront for over 20 years.
Wow. And your other Arthur, he has a record store down in Longview?
Yeah, he's like in an antique mall as well. So right. Again, it's just another way of promoting our label, but promoting just music and whatnot.
So are you guys finding how is music, or how is album collecting going these days? Are more people coming in buying albums to relive their youth? Are you selling more vinyl?
Oh yeah. Yeah. The hobby, I guess, has grown considerably during the last 10 years. I read somewhere here just recently that that vinyl actually outsold any other medium for the first time since 1991.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. So it's definitely an uptick. A lot of new collectors, a lot of people who are rediscovering their collections, and also are like, man, I had a great collection, I got rid of it, and now I'm like rebuying it.
That would be me.
Yeah.
I don't know what I did. Yeah, I don't know. But you've heard that story from all of us, I'm sure.
Oh yeah. Well, a lot of people went to CDs for a lot of reasons, and vinyl sounds better. I mean, you're going to get a lot better low end and that warm sound, and for collectors, they want the album cover, they want to look at the liner notes, they want to crack the seal and smell it. I mean, it's kind of crazy that way, but it is.
Oh, I that was one of the things that bothered me so much about CDs, going to CDs, and when I was in college, is that, I used to, you remember the budget records and tapes on 112th and Pacific?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So I would go in there, and I could talk them out of all their posters. And remember when Cheap Trick did the Dream Police album?
Yeah.
And they had these cutouts of the guys. I got those from them.
I wanted them so bad.
And I don't know where they are.
Oh man.
I got Stuart Copeland's Clark Kent. Did you ever see Stuart Copeland's green 10-inch?
Yeah. Yeah, it's good with the cutout K-shaped album.
Yeah. Yeah, they were good to me. And that was the stuff that it connected you on a different level than a jewel case with a shiny little disc in it that you could play in your car. It was cool, but it, Greg Kinnear, was it Kinnear?
Oh yeah. Ken Kinnear actually had
sorry, the senior moment. That was the name I was looking for. Ken Kinnear.
Yep. Yeah. He promoted shows as well as having his own record label. Yeah.
I didn't know he had a record label, but okay. So that was the name I was searching for. So this episode has been a success. We've solved my old memory. So I'd like to, before we wrap this up, I want to talk about the record label, because I think it's great that you guys are working to reintroduce bands. I think it's great that you are doing vinyl. You also do CDs. I know that, but I think vinyl is awesome.
Yeah.
Where are you getting these pressed at?
We're getting our records pressed at Cascade Record in Milwaukee, which is southeast of Portland.
Okay. You said Milwaukee, and I was thinking, you said Cascade Records, Milwaukee, and I was thinking, there's no Cascades in Wisconsin.
Yeah, it's southeast Portland. It's in the neighborhood or area called Milwaukee. They moved into the state of Washington a few years ago. They were originally from California. It was a label called TKO, oddly enough. And they were primarily a punk rock label. And the gentleman who runs the label, Mark Rainey, he still does a lot of punk rock, but they do everything. And they have 7 or 8 record presses now. They started with like 2 or 3 8 or 9 years ago, and now they're up to like 7, and they're like busy all the time. They're doing local stuff, but they're doing, big band, national acts. They're just looking for any place that will press records. So we get that done there. We get our mothers or our pressing plates done in California. Mastering done at Telegraph, again out of California. And so it's a process. I mean, we get our sleeves printed and assembled in Canada, and all this stuff kind of gets mailed to us, and we assemble it all ourselves, partly for economics, but it's also, you get your hands in it. We hand number everything, put them in sleeves. Very cool. We do inserts and booklets, and we make it a real nice package with good liner notes and imagery that a lot of times people haven't seen before. But we're exposing to the music listener a ton of stuff they've never heard before, and that's really important when you're collecting, because you want to get something you've never heard before. You want to get exposed to different things. We started off with a sampler because we wanted to give people a nice palette of different sounds from the Pacific Northwest, and then samplers. I've always been kind of a sucker for samplers. Back in the days before the internet, you just couldn't dial up. I want to listen to stuff that sounds like Simply Red. You had to go out and buy the record.
Why would you do that?
Yeah, I know. But like our first sampler has 11 different bands on it, and they're bands that sound somewhat similar, but were quite a bit different, because there are lots of different styles of hard rock. And so we just wanted to give the listener, just something different. And we've been pretty successful at that. We've done 2 samplers. Our last sampler was actually in homage to the Lake Hills scene. So we have bands that played Lake Hills. A couple of the tracks are actually live tracks from Lake Hills. But most of the tracks are songs that had never been released. And so it was really great to release this stuff to the world. We've got, we did a TKO record that had never been out before. We'd had the music for quite a while, and no one ever was going to do anything with it. So we negotiated with the existing members of the band, and they agreed to terms. So we released it, and fantastic record. Previously mentioned Whiskey Stick, a band that had recorded their album, 30 years prior, but never put it out. And now they're fathers and grandfathers, and they have this record that they can show their kids and their grandkids and say, yeah, we really did this. Another band, Overlord, they were kind of the precursor to grunge. They had a real kind of punky kind of metal sound, kind of almost crossover to some extent, maybe even a little glammy in places. We expanded on their 5-song EP to a full 10-song album with songs that hadn't been released before. And it was an album, an EP or an album that you couldn't find anymore. And when you did find it, like on eBay or Gem or wherever, it was really expensive. And so we didn't want to rehash the same package. We wanted to enhance the package. So we expanded on it, and that went over really well. The band was, the band members were ecstatic that, it could get back out into the world, because I think that they were just a little before their time, and had they recorded this record 5 years later, we'd be talking about that band along with Nirvana and Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, because they were that good of a band. They just were just a bit ahead. We did the first Heir Apparent record, Heir Apparent's another progressive metal band, strong guitars and great operatic vocals with some keyboards. They were a really great live band. And again, they just kind of fell apart. They had a couple of records out. Their first record was only produced in small numbers to a German label, and hardly any of the records got here. So that was our first full album record that we did, and it met with really great response. We sold most of them to Europe, and we've sold. That's actually our first sellout, and so it's we just felt like it was important for people to rediscover certain bands, and of course along the way we discovered a ton of bands that we didn't know about. That again, we've got a long list of releases we'd like to do.
All right, so let's go down that road. Well, we're going to pause. I want to ask you a Brian Naron question. Where was your favorite venue to see music in the 80s and 90s? Where'd you like to go?
I really liked the Central Tavern, and it was a very quaint little tavern. I mean, it wasn't very big, and that was kind of common, especially over there in Pioneer Square. A lot of the places were kind of small. There was just a great vibe in that room. Saw some incredible bands in there. The sound was okay, but it was just like one of those places. Astor Park was another great venue. It was laid out pretty nice. When they had dance bands in there was room to dance. When they had hard rock shows in there, they could pack it out. A Hall of Fame. I loved the Hall of Fame. It was underground. Had a great look in there. Great sound system, I thought. Waldo's was a great venue. Waldo's was in Kirkland. I thought it was great. I didn't get any trouble there.
There's a story.
Yeah, I'm sure there is.
There's a story.
In Tacoma, there, the Swiss was always a great room to see bands.
Did you ever go to the Huntsman?
Oh boy, that's a long. Yeah, I've been there. I don't remember much about it, but I remember being there. Yeah.
Did you ever go to the Back 40?
The Back 40 burnt down for the last time before I turned 21. So no, I didn't see any bands there, but a lot of my favorite bands did play the Back 40.
Or did you ever go to Leslie's?
Shipwreck was great. Leslie's was great. Yeah. But there was always, there was always a scene within a scene at Leslie's.
Yeah, that was. Did you ever get to go to the ranch in Ellensburg? Did you ever journey across the mountains?
Yeah, I did. I've seen a couple of shows there. And I'll be darned if I know I saw a couple of shows. It was probably Pearson related shows.
Yeah, maybe. But that was a cool event. That was a really cool venue. Mm-hmm. It was, I was talking to Mike Wansley, and he relayed that at the time, the inlaid dance floor was the largest inlaid dance floor on the West Coast. So inlaid wood. So I was like, interesting. But yeah, that was an interesting venue. Okay. So we talked about your favorite. Well, put you on the spot. So I'm going to give you the 80s and 90s. Who is the band that you like to see the most? Who is the most fun for you live?
As far as like hard rock bands, metal bands,
yeah, hard rock bands, or any band in general. We can open it up if you want, but hard rock. Let's start with hard rock.
I mean, I guess I would say that a band like Culprit or band like Faustus, I really love that band. They were kind of a mid-late 90s band, and they made it into the book, but they were just highly polished musicians. I mean, Queensryche, I've seen Queensryche so many times, but ironically, it's they never really played clubs. They went from the rehearsal room to the big stage, and their story is a great story of just serendipity, the right place, right time, right people. Right. Ironically, I spent a lot of time in the 80s and early 90s chasing a lot of the like dance rock bands. Like I mentioned before, the Heats, the Cowboys, the Allies, Billy Rancher and the Unreal Gods, Johnny and the Distractions. There was a lot of great Tacoma bands, Blue Baboons, Stripes, the Statics, the Groceries. A lot of the bands in the 80s.
Right.
But hard rock's always been kind of
that's your thing.
My thing. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to wrap this up. Well, first off, before we wrap it up, your records and CDs only online, or are they available they're available at the stores, but are they at other record stores in the Seattle?
Yeah, our albums and CDs are in 4,000 Holes in Spokane. They're at Music Millennium in Portland. They're in Jet Records in Salem. They are in House of Records, Turntable Treasures in Tacoma. High Voltage in Tacoma has our product in there. My store, of course, in Puyallup at 3rd Street Antiques. And then online at northwestmetalworksmusic.com. We have a website with our product, the records that we've put out, but we also support other labels that support local music. So we have music from Lost Realm and Heaven and Hell Records. Heaven and Hell's in Philadelphia. Lost Realm is in Portugal. But they have an affinity for Northwest music, and so we support their products as well.
Okay. You mentioned Queensryche. What's next for you guys?
Well, we took advantage of the fact that a couple of things. We were done writing the book, and we were spending a lot of time editing. James, the primary writer, James Beach, he still writes for a living. That's what he does. He also helps in publishing with another friend of his. And so he's just all about books and publications and things as such. I had the misfortune of spending 17 weeks on COVID layoff, basically. But I took advantage of that time. James and I have decided that while we were editing this monster of a book, we decided to do another book. And the book that I had on my mind was a biography of Queensryche. Queensryche is probably one of my favorite bands of all time. I know a lot about them. I collect them to the nth degree. But they're also a band that has never had a bio written on them. A band as big, international as Queensryche is an important band in the genre, has never had a biography. There was a couple of guys in Germany who did a really great reference guide back about 95, 96 for the collector, CDs and albums and memorabilia. But their story, if you go online and Google Queensryche, you get this stock story. It's this very kind of plain Jane story. And I knew that there was a lot more to tell, just from my firsthand experience and knowing a lot of people involved with the band. So we decided that this was going to be our next book. And so we spent a lot of that time during that 17 weeks. I did a lot of research, lining up quotes, and I have a ton of memorabilia that will be in the book, just like we did with this first one. It's not going to be anywhere near as big and monstrous, but it's going to be telling a story about a really important progressive hard rock metal band. And so we're about 85,000 words into it. We've got kind of the main story. We're filling in with a lot of interviews. We're building the story around the memories of the band, interviews with their family, friends, promoters, other people that had experiences, and it's turning out to be really great. And there's going to be some great surprises. We're telling some stories of people who have never really told their story about the band, and we're going to be able to fill in a lot of blanks for like the hardcore collector like me, who thought I knew a lot about the band, but I've learned a ton more about the band. So other people like myself are going to they're going to be thrilled to read, I think, the information that we provide them. And again, this is about telling a story, celebrating the 40th year of this band's existence. We've heard a lot of things. We know a lot of things. We're certainly not going to tell a salacious story. That seems to be the best.
You are not tabloid.
No. We're just trying to tell as complete story as we can about this really unique band. Really, I mean, and they've been able to persevere through the rise and really the fall, and then they've come back into the consciousness, and not only that, they've all managed to do their thing. Like I say, Jeff has got a good career. He's obviously no longer the singer in the band, but he's moved on and doing some great things. The new band with their new singer, high level of performances live, high performance in the studio. So that's what we're into. And our hope is to have this book on the shelves and available for sale the end of this year or the first part of 22 to coincide with the band's 40th anniversary.
Well, that's awesome. And so thank you for being on here. This is great, because I love the fact of how excited you are about this stuff. That this is what you do. And you got this smile on your face when you're telling these stories that you can't see because there's no video for podcast, but you're into this, and anybody that puts out a 900-page book on any topic has to be committed.
Yeah. Committed.
Mentally committed and committed to the process. I mean, it was staggering when it arrived. I was like, because I told you, I told you I bought it, right?
Yeah.
And the tracking number was weird, and then it showed up. It was pretty funny, but it's like I'm just looking at it going, I don't know. This is. I knew it was. You say it's 900 pages on the website. I mean, you lay it out. Like, by the way, folks, this is a really large. But it's once you get in your hand and you start looking through it, it's dense.
Yeah,
it's dense, and it's cool. Yeah. It's really cool. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your support. It's been a really great process. It's a lot of work, but a lot of joy, and we're getting just nothing but just great feedback, and that was our goal, because our mantra is we just want to make people happy, and we're doing that.
That's very cool. So, well, I will put links below all of this to find you guys online. I encourage you guys all that are listening to go check these guys out. And thanks for being on, Brian.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.
Join us next time for another episode of the Exploring Washington State podcast.